Behind the glamour of Hollywood's golden age lies a story rarely told. For 30 years, Johnny Carson sat face to face with the greatest stars in film history, and he saw them as no one else did. Not the polished icons the world adored, but real people carrying real pain. This is the story of 8 legends, their hidden battles, and the moments that revealed who they truly were behind the spotlight. Actor 1. John Wayne. She won 2 Academy Awards, built a career spanning 6 decades, and became known for one of the most unfiltered, unapologetic personalities in Hollywood. Shelley Winters never tried to be the glamorous starlet the studios wanted, and that refusal to conform came with real professional and personal consequences. Winters began her career in the 1940s as a contract player at Universal, often cast in decorative, sexy blonde roles that she felt gave her little room to actually act. She fought against this typecasting for years, famously deliberately gaining weight for roles as she got older, specifically to prove she could be taken seriously as a character actress rather than remain confined to glamour parts. A bold move in an industry obsessed with actresses maintaining a certain look. That strategy paid off. Winters won her first Academy Award for The Diary of Anne Frank in 1959, and her second for A Patch of Blue in 1965, proving her range extended far beyond what early Hollywood had wanted from her. She became known for taking difficult, physically demanding roles, including her performance in The Poseidon Adventure in 1972, where at nearly 50 years old, she performed her own underwater stunts. Winters's personal life was famously turbulent. She married 4 times, including a widely publicized marriage to actor Vittorio Gassman and another to actor Anthony Franciosa, both relationships that ended amid very public difficulties. She was open in interviews, including her appearances with Johnny Carson, about the challenges of maintaining relationships while working constantly and refusing to soften her strong opinions for a partner's comfort. By the time Winters became a frequent guest on The Tonight Show throughout the 1970s and 1980s, she had built a reputation as one of Carson's most unpredictable and entertaining interviews. She was known for arriving with elaborate, sometimes chaotic stories, speaking her mind bluntly about other actors and directors, and famously showing little concern for maintaining the polished, controlled image other stars carefully protected on camera. Carson often let her conversations run long specifically because her candidness produced genuinely unscripted, memorable television. Winters also became known later in life as an author, writing 2 candid memoirs about her career and relationships that shocked some in Hollywood with their honesty about affairs, insecurities, and industry politics that most stars kept private. Shelley Winters passed away on January 14, 2006, at age 85, after a long battle with heart disease. She left behind a body of work that proved an actress didn't need to fit Hollywood's narrow mold of glamour to have a lasting, celebrated career. For Johnny Carson, Winters represented one of his most genuinely enjoyable recurring guests, someone who never performed a version of herself for the cameras, because the real Shelley Winters was already more entertaining than any performance could be. Number 2. Marlon Brando. He didn't just act, he changed what acting meant. Marlon Brando walked onto a Hollywood stage built on polish and glamour, and tore it apart with raw, unpredictable honesty. But the man Johnny Carson encountered off-camera was even more complicated than the legend suggested. Brando was famously reluctant to appear on talk shows. He viewed them as artificial, performative, the very thing his acting philosophy rejected. Carson managed to secure only a handful of interviews with him throughout his career, and each one became must-watch television precisely because Brando refused to play by the rules. He would deflect questions with sharp wit, turn interviews back on the host, or simply sit in uncomfortable silence rather than give a rehearsed answer. Where other stars performed charm, Brando performed nothing at all, and audiences found that unpredictability magnetic. Carson, a master of controlling the pace of conversation, later admitted that interviewing Brando required an entirely different approach. Less steering, more patience. Off-screen, Brando's life was equally unconventional. He was known for his deep skepticism of Hollywood's culture of image management, often showing up to events without the polish expected of a leading man. Friends and colleagues described him as someone who valued authenticity over vanity, sometimes to the frustration of studios trying to market him as a traditional star. His personal life carried real weight too. Brando was a vocal advocate for civil rights and indigenous rights long before it was common for celebrities to take public political stances. Appearances that sometimes overshadowed his film work in the press, but which he stood behind unapologetically, even when it cost him professionally. By the time he appeared on Carson's show in later years, Brando had become something of a recluse, granting interviews rarely and on his own terms. When he did sit across from Carson, viewers saw glimpses of the sharp, restless intelligence that had made him a legend, paired with a visible discomfort with fame itself, a tension he never fully resolved. Brando passed away in 2004, leaving behind a legacy that reshaped modern acting entirely. For Johnny Carson, he remained one of the most fascinating enigmas to ever sit in that guest chair. A man who redefined stardom while quietly resisting everything stardom demanded of him. Number 3. Orson Welles. He redefined cinema before he turned 25. Orson Welles wrote, directed, produced, and starred in Citizen Kane, a film so ahead of its time that Hollywood didn't fully understand what it had. But by the time he sat across from Johnny Carson decades later, the industry had turned its back on the very genius it once celebrated. Welles became a frequent and beloved guest on The Tonight Show throughout the 1970s. By then, physically, he was a different man than the sharp young director of Kane. Heavier, slower moving, often dressed in loose, dark suits. But Carson and audiences alike were captivated by something that hadn't changed at all: his voice, his storytelling, and his effortless command of a room. What made Welles's Tonight Show appearances legendary wasn't nostalgia. It was his sheer unpredictability. He was a trained magician and loved performing card tricks live on air, often leaning in close to Carson's desk to walk him through a trick step by step. Carson, who admired Welles immensely, would lean in with genuine curiosity, letting the segment run long because the audience simply didn't want it to end. Behind the charm was a more complicated reality. Welles struggled for decades to secure funding for his projects after early clashes with studios over creative control. Films he poured years into were left unfinished, victims of a Hollywood system that had once celebrated his brilliance and later found him difficult to work with. Colleagues described a man both fiercely proud of his early triumphs and quietly frustrated by an industry that never gave him the same creative freedom twice. Despite this, Welles never lost his wit. Interviews with Carson often turned into extended, freewheeling conversations, Welles telling stories about Hollywood's golden age with the same theatrical flair he brought to his films, refusing to let decades of industry rejection dim his presence on screen. Welles passed away in 1985, still working, still pitching new projects until the very end. For Johnny Carson, he represented something rare: a guest whose genius never needed validation from the very industry that had once tried to define him, and then failed to know what to do with him. Number 4. Bette Davis. She was never interested in being liked. Bette Davis was interested in being respected, and in an industry built on charm and vanity, that made her one of the most fearless, formidable presences Hollywood had ever produced. By the time she sat across from Johnny Carson in the 1970s and 80s, she had spent nearly 5 decades proving that talent, not likability, was what made a legend. Davis was famous for her sharp tongue, and Carson knew exactly what he was getting whenever she appeared on The Tonight Show. She didn't give safe, rehearsed answers. She gave opinions, blunt, unfiltered, and often devastatingly funny. Carson, who thrived on genuine conversation rather than scripted promotion, considered her one of his favorite guests precisely because she refused to perform a version of herself that wasn't true. Her career had been built on defiance from the very beginning. In the 1930s, at the height of the studio system, Davis famously challenged Warner Brothers in court over unfair contract terms that restricted the roles she could take. A legal battle she ultimately lost, but one that made her a pioneer in the fight for actors' creative control. It was a fight most stars of her era wouldn't have dared to take on, and it cost her professionally in the short term. But it also cemented her reputation as a woman who valued artistic integrity over easy comfort, a reputation she carried proudly for the rest of her life. By the time she was a regular guest on Carson's show, Davis had outlived and outlasted most of her Hollywood contemporaries. She had 2 Academy Awards, a career spanning both the silent-to-sound transition and the new Hollywood era, and absolutely no patience for pretension. She spoke candidly about aging in an industry obsessed with youth, about the roles she'd fought for, and about colleagues she respected and those she didn't, often naming names, much to Carson's visible amusement. She also carried real personal struggles behind the sharp wit. Davis had been through difficult marriages, public professional rivalries, most famously with Joan Crawford, and later in life, health challenges including a stroke and breast cancer diagnosis in the early 1980s. She discussed these battles on air with the same directness she brought to everything else, refusing to be pitted, insisting instead on being understood. What made her Tonight Show appearances so compelling wasn't glamour. It was honesty. Davis treated the interview chair the way she treated a film set, as a place to tell the truth, even when the truth was uncomfortable. Carson gave her the room to do exactly that, rarely interrupting, often simply letting her talk. Bette Davis passed away in 1989, having spent 60 years refusing to be anything other than exactly who she was. For Johnny Carson, she remained proof that the most unforgettable guests weren't the ones who charmed an audience. They were the ones who told them the truth. Number 5. Judy Garland. She was Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz before she was even a teenager. One of the most beloved voices in film history, a star who never had the chance to simply grow up outside the spotlight. By the time Judy Garland appeared on The Tonight Show in the late 1960s, Johnny Carson wasn't just interviewing a legend. He was sitting across from someone the entire country had watched grow up on screen, and someone who had paid an extraordinary price for it. Garland's story began in MGM's studio system, where child stars were pushed through grueling schedules and, as later widely documented, given medication to manage energy and weight from a young age. A practice that contributed to lifelong struggles with substance dependency that Garland battled for the rest of her life. It's a chapter of Hollywood history that's since become a cautionary tale about how the industry treated its youngest stars, and Garland was one of its most visible casualties. Despite this, her talent never dimmed. She remained one of the most sought-after performers of her generation, delivering legendary performances well into adulthood, including her Oscar-nominated role in A Star is Born. When she appeared on Carson's show, audiences saw flashes of the brilliance that had made her a star as a child, but also a woman who had lived through more industry pressure, personal loss, and public scrutiny than almost anyone of her era. Carson treated her with noticeable gentleness during their interviews, a departure from his usual sharp, quick-witted style. He let her talk at length about her children, her career, and her ongoing effort to reclaim her own narrative after decades of being shaped by studios, tabloids, and public opinion. Those close to Carson later said he held genuine admiration and concern for her, recognizing that Garland carried a kind of exhaustion that stardom rarely allows its icons to show. Her later years were marked by financial difficulties, health struggles, and a relentless media spotlight that rarely gave her room to simply be a person rather than a symbol. Yet she continued performing, continued showing up, and continued connecting with audiences through a voice that remained, by every account, one of the most powerful in entertainment history. Judy Garland passed away in 1969 at just 47 years old. Her death sent shockwaves through Hollywood and became a turning point in conversations about how the industry treated its young stars. For Johnny Carson, her memory remained a reminder of the extraordinary talent she carried, and the very real toll fame had taken on someone who never truly got the chance to live outside its shadow. Number 6. Richard Burton. He was widely regarded as one of the finest stage actors of his generation before Hollywood ever put him on screen. A voice trained in Shakespeare, capable of commanding total silence in a room the moment he began to speak. Richard Burton brought that same gravity to every Tonight Show appearance, and Johnny Carson considered him one of the most intellectually electrifying guests he ever hosted. Burton's path to stardom began on the British stage, where critics and peers alike considered him a generational talent, often compared to Laurence Olivier. His transition to Hollywood brought him global fame, but it also brought a level of public scrutiny few actors of his era experienced, most notably through his highly publicized, on-again off-again marriage to Elizabeth Taylor, one of the most closely followed celebrity relationships in 20th century entertainment history. When Burton appeared on Carson's show, audiences didn't get typical promotional small talk. They got literature, philosophy, and stories delivered with the same command he brought to the stage. Carson, who deeply respected genuine intellect, often let Burton's answers run long, recognizing that few guests could hold an audience's attention through sheer verbal skill alone the way Burton could. Burton was also open, at times, about his long, well-documented struggle with alcohol, a battle he acknowledged publicly later in life as he worked to manage it. It was a strikingly honest admission for a major film star to make on national television during an era when such struggles were rarely discussed openly. Colleagues who worked alongside him often noted the contrast between his commanding public presence and the private difficulties he faced trying to balance immense fame with personal health. Despite these struggles, Burton's body of work remained extraordinary. 7 Academy Award nominations across a career that spanned classical theater and major Hollywood films, without ever winning the Oscar many critics felt he deserved. It became one of the most talked-about oversights in Academy history, a fact Burton addressed with characteristic wit rather than bitterness whenever it came up in interviews. Richard Burton passed away in 1984 at the age of 58. For Johnny Carson, he remained an unforgettable presence, proof that some guests didn't need scripted stories or rehearsed charm. They simply needed to open their mouths, and the entire room would lean in. Number 7. Walter Matthau. He built an entire career on playing the lovable grump, the disheveled, sharp-tongued everyman audiences couldn't help but adore. Walter Matthau brought that same effortless charm to The Tonight Show, and Johnny Carson considered him one of the most genuinely funny, unscripted guests he ever had the pleasure of hosting. Matthau's path to stardom wasn't a straight line. He spent years on the Broadway stage before Hollywood took notice, developing a comedic timing that felt completely natural precisely because it had been sharpened through live theater, where there's no room for a second take. When he finally broke through in films like The Odd Couple, playing the perpetually messy Oscar Madison, audiences quickly realized Matthau wasn't just playing a character. He was drawing from a genuine, well-documented love of chaos, spontaneity, and mischief that defined his real personality. One of Matthau's most famous off-screen passions was horse racing. He was an unapologetic, lifelong gambler, openly discussing his trips to the racetrack in interviews with the same self-deprecating humor he brought to his film roles. Carson, who enjoyed Matthau's willingness to poke fun at his own vices, often used it as a running joke throughout their many interviews together. Matthau never once taking offense, always ready with a sharper comeback. What made Matthau such a beloved guest wasn't polish. It was authenticity. He showed up as himself, rumpled, quick-witted, utterly unconcerned with maintaining a glamorous Hollywood image. Colleagues frequently noted that off-screen, Matthau was remarkably similar to the characters he played. Warm, wry, and allergic to pretension. In an industry built on image management, his refusal to perform stardom became its own kind of charm. Despite his easygoing on-screen persona, Matthau took his craft seriously, earning an Academy Award for The Fortune Cookie and going on to build one of the most enduring comedic partnerships in film history alongside Jack Lemmon, spanning decades and multiple beloved films. Walter Matthau passed away in 2000, having spent a lifetime making audiences laugh without ever chasing glamour. For Johnny Carson, he remained one of the easiest, most enjoyable guests to sit across from. Proof that the biggest laughs often come from the people who take themselves the least seriously. Number 8. Shelley Winters. She was loud, unpredictable, and completely unwilling to fit into Hollywood's mold of quiet, polished femininity. And that's exactly what made Shelley Winters unforgettable. A two-time Academy Award winner, Winters brought the same electric, larger-than-life energy to The Tonight Show that she brought to every film set. And Johnny Carson considered her interviews some of the most delightfully chaotic television he ever hosted. Winters' career spanned decades and genres, from dramatic roles in A Place in the Sun to her Oscar-winning performances in The Diary of Anne Frank and A Patch of Blue. But what set her apart wasn't just range, it was her fearlessness. She was known throughout Hollywood for speaking her mind bluntly, regardless of who was listening, at a time when actresses were often expected to stay carefully diplomatic in public. Her Tonight Show appearances became famous for their unpredictability. Winters spoke loudly, gestured wildly, and told sprawling, dramatic stories that rarely stayed on script, much to the audience's delight. Carson, a master of steering conversations, openly admitted that interviewing Winters required a different strategy entirely. Less directing, more simply letting her take over the segment, because audiences loved every unfiltered minute of it. Off-screen, Winters was equally known for living life on her own terms. She was married 4 times, including to fellow actor Anthony Franciosa, and was famously candid about her relationships, her ambitions, and her refusal to slow down as she aged in an industry that often pushed older actresses to the sidelines. She continued working steadily well into her later decades, refusing to accept that her best roles were behind her. Colleagues often described her as a whirlwind, generous, dramatic, endlessly entertaining, and utterly without pretension. She wasn't interested in maintaining a polished Hollywood image, and that authenticity, paired with genuine talent, made her one of the most beloved character actresses of her generation. Shelley Winters passed away in 2006, having spent a career proving that being unapologetically yourself could be just as powerful as being perfectly poised. For Johnny Carson, she remained one of his favorite guests precisely because she never tried to be anyone other than exactly who she was.